everyone for joining. This meeting is being recorded, no problem. So I'm here to present some results from a paper with my co-authors, Ala, Will, and Alexandra. Most of us are over at Stanford, and our paper is on the Mo Salah effect. Can exposure to celebrities reduce prejudice? Just an overview of the talk. So I'll start by highlighting the problem, how contact is one way to solve that problem of prejudice. And then I'll dive into our research design, which focuses on a three-pronged approach. The first is looking at hate crimes. The second is an analysis of tweets. And the third is an original survey experiment. And then I'll end with a discussion of some implications and generalizability. So it probably won't come as a surprise to you guys that prejudice is on the rise over the past few years, at least as a revealed preference. It looks like that is the case all over the world, but also in the UK. So we see this spike after Brexit in the recorded number of hate crimes across the UK. On the right here is some data from a YouGov poll on the percent of people who say that Islam clashes with British values. So looking specifically at Muslims, we see the similar trend after Brexit, although it's tapering down a little bit. So we know that Brexit itself was driven largely by immigration sentiment. We know that a lot of this is directed toward immigrants and Muslims in particular. So what tools do we have to ameliorate prejudice? There's a lot. The one that we probably have the most promising evidence based on is intergroup contact. It's the idea that positive, cooperative, meaningful contact with people from outgroups can reduce prejudice and build friendships and change social norms. So you can potentially unlock all of these rewards to intergroup contact, but it's pretty uncommon. In the UK in particular, and just in general, it's hard to orchestrate that kind of really meaningful contact between people. So fortunately, there is one Muslim in particular who a lot of British people have had some form of contact with, and that person is Mohamed Salah. He's an Egyptian soccer star. I'm not gonna bore you with his credentials. There's a lot of them. He's won now the English title. He's won the European title. He led Egypt to the 2018 World Cup for the first time in 20 or so years, 30 years rather. And so he's really one of these elite soccer players. And what's really special about him, as you're going to see, is that he's not just an elite soccer player, but he's very public about his faith, about his Muslim faith. So here's a video that kind of illustrates this better than I probably could explain it to you.
Sorry, we can't see that.
Salma, we can't see the video.
Can you see the video?
No.
Oh, that's so sad. Okay, so the video was of some Liverpool supporters chanting, and their chant is, Mo Salah, sitting in a mosque is where I want to be. If he's good enough for you, if he's good enough for me, he's good enough for you. If he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too. So this is really unusual, not to paint soccer fans with a broad brush, being one of them myself, but this is pretty unusual behavior from soccer fans, especially traveling fans. And for them to be so open about talking about wanting to be Muslim and wanting to sit in a mosque, even if it is a bit tongue-in-cheek, these are really positive signs that there's some link that's being made in the minds of fans between Salah and Muslims and Islam more broadly that suggests that there really might be a positive effect on Islamophobia. So, and this is not, we're not the first people to note this. There's been a lot of speculation about a potential Salah effect across headlines. We've had the New Yorker and the New York Times and others saying that there seems to be some impression that he is changing people's perceptions of Muslims more broadly, and he's confronting racism, he's confronting Islamophobia. So with that, we wanted to really test this empirically, and our research question is, can exposure to celebrities from stigmatized groups reduce prejudice? And more specifically, can exposure to Mohamed Salah reduce Islamophobic behaviors and attitudes? So what do we know about contact and when does it work best? This is a classic social psychological theory that's been around for half a century or more. And the idea is that positive contact, when it meets certain conditions, can unlock all these positive effects. The most common conditions that are cited are thought to be that contact should be endorsed by communal authorities. So you should have the customs, rules, rule of law, and norms on your side when engaging in that contact. It shouldn't be stigmatized or taboo. You should be working toward a common goal, so you shouldn't be competing against each other. It should place people at least within the context of the intervention or within the contact, on equal footing. So you shouldn't have these like power disparities within the contact. That's going to just perpetuate other inequalities. And then lastly, that the contact should involve cooperation, which is very similar to the idea that it should involve a common goal. So again, the idea that you're on the same side and working towards a unified goal. So now when we look at the case of the exposure of Liverpool supporters to Salah, so this is a very particular form of contact in many ways. It is endorsed by communal authorities in one sense. You have the clubs, coaches, and institutions are behind him. You do have a common goal. You want your club to win, and so does he. But it's not necessarily egalitarian, so you don't really have this equal power status happening in this contact setting. And it doesn't necessarily involve cooperation, right? Like you're not face-to-face, you're not cooperating to achieve something. It's really this one-sided exposure rather than the meaningful contact that's prevalent in this literature. So it might be helpful for us to think a little bit more about exposure rather than contact, kind of a subset of intergroup contact. And what do we know about virtual contact or virtual exposure? So this one-sided exposure to outgroups. We know that when the outgroup is imagined, so when you ask people to read a prompt and they say, imagine that you've come into contact with person X, or ask them to engage in perspective taking exercises. So imagine that you're in the footsteps of a Syrian refugee, or ask them to play these like online role-playing games where they're living the life of this person. So this kind of exposure to imagined or fictional outgroups, we know generally works. It at least in the short term, it induces empathy and reduces prejudice. But this leaves a really important gap in our knowledge, which is what about virtual exposure to real life outgroup members, which is different in many ways. And so we do have some good causal evidence on this question. So we have studies from, for example, people walking by Confederates in the US who are dressed like homeless people, or people on the Boston subway system who are exposed to Spanish speakers or ethnic minorities, and people in Greece and Austria who are exposed to refugees. And so we have some evidence on this idea of physical exposure. So again, one-sided. But the issue here is that that kind of exposure seems very different from exposure to Salah. Like it doesn't carry the same valence. And we have this important dimension that differentiates them, which is physical versus virtual. And we actually know that this physical exposure is negative. So when you just walk past someone from the outgroup, it's not likely to improve your intergroup attitudes. If anything, it's actually been found to worsen it. So what we know about exposure either involves imagined outgroups, or when it involves real life members of the outgroup, it's this kind of physical, meaningless, wordless exposure, which seems very different from the case of Salah. And so again, we don't really know what we would expect to see for the case of virtual exposure to a real life outgroup member. Especially given that Salah is this popular figure who's much beloved by fans. So the valence that he carries it's different to these other outgroups in the experimental settings that I just described. So just to preview our main argument and to tie this up to the research design in a second, we think that exposure to celebrities is most likely to reduce prejudice when two conditions are met. The first is that the exposure is positive. And there's two aspects of Salah's personality in particular that make us think that exposure to him is positive. First is his character. So he's very charismatic, he's always smiling, he has a very positive attitude, and this is something that's common knowledge among fans. And the second is that he's obviously been very successful as an individual and also at the team level. And so we actually map on these different aspects of positivity a little bit later in our survey. And we think that these might map on to two particular mechanisms. So the first is like when you're exposed to his character and he's very charismatic, that potentially might challenge stereotypes of Muslims. So dominant stereotypes of Muslims in the UK, but also elsewhere, are that they are violent, extremist, very rigid in their thinking, inflexible, not open-minded, and he's very much does not fit into that trope. And the fact that he has been very successful might map onto a more problematic mechanism, which is he might represent this model minority. So people only like him as long as he keeps scoring goals and because he's successful. And once those goals stop, then maybe that maybe all these positive effects will disappear. So the first condition there is positivity of the exposure. And the second is that the celebrity's group identity should be salient. And in a way, this is kind of obvious, right? Like you need to know that that celebrity is from that group in order for your attitudes toward that celebrity to potentially generalize to the entire outgroup. And we have a lot of soccer players who are Muslim, like he's definitely not the first, but their group identity, their identity as a Muslim is not very salient for the most part. Salah was really kind of a groundbreaker in this regard. So he prays after he scores a goal, which is very visible. He points his like index finger to the sky and he recites a Muslim prayer also when he scores. He named his daughter Mecca after the holiest site in Islam. His wife wears a hijab, she wears a veil, and you can often see her on the sidelines as well during games. He posts on his social media when it's Eid or when it's other Muslim holidays a lot of the time. So he's very obviously Muslim and a practicing Muslim. And this is important. So it makes it harder to view him as an exception. Whereas other Muslim soccer players, for example, like Zinedine Zidane or other superstars, they're not necessarily associated with Islam in the minds of many fans because they're not so public about their religiosity. And here the possible mechanism might be that you're making that this kind of public salience of the group identity, when you really know this person belongs to outgroup X, it makes it much easier to generalize to the entire outgroup, and you're less likely to see them, again, as exceptional. You're more likely to see them as representative of their group. So to outline our research design, so we have 3 sources of data. The first consists of an analysis of hate crime data from police departments across the UK. Then we look at an analysis of anti-Muslim tweets by soccer fans also based in the UK from Liverpool and other clubs. And then lastly, we explore some of these mechanisms I just outlined using an original survey experiment of Liverpool fans in the UK. So starting with hate crimes, so we wanted to collect data through freedom of information requests from all UK police jurisdictions. Actually, it was actually English police jurisdictions to be specific. We asked for monthly hate crime data from January 2015 to April 2018, and Salah joined in June of 2017, so kind of midway through this period. And from this exercise, we ended up with just over 900 month county observations. And our goal here is we need to construct a counterfactual to figure out what the hate crime rate would have been in the county of Merseyside, which is where Liverpool is, had Salah not joined Liverpool. And then we compare that imputed counterfactual with what actually happened, the hate crime rate that we actually do observe. We do this using a matrix completion method. And the intuition behind this is that we take the data, the baseline data, so the pre-treatment period before he joins, from the control units, so all the counties that aren't Merseyside, and then we kind of upweight the counties that have the most similar pre-treatment trends to Merseyside. And then we do this to impute this unobserved counterfactual, and then we compare the predicted hate crime rate for Merseyside compared to the synthetic control, and then we look at what actually happened, and that's how we generate our treatment effect estimate. So I'm gonna dive right into the results. So here you can see in black is Merseyside, and we can see what actually happened in Merseyside versus the imputed, which is the blue dashed line. And so what you see here in this blue dashed line is the synthetic control. So what we would have expected based on trends of similar counties in the pre-treatment period, and when we compare that to what we actually saw in Merseyside, we see about a 16% reduction in hate crimes relative to what we would have expected. I'll go straight into the second analysis. So we're looking here at anti-Muslim tweets, and we use actually the exact same research design. So in this case, yes.
It's about Liverpool versus Everton or any other club. So I understand that Liverpool fans love him, but would Everton fans or fans of clubs that lose because he scores a goal also benefit from his charisma?
That's a great question. I'm actually going to get to this in 1 second. So what Sasha is alluding to is that the county of Merseyside and the city of Liverpool actually have two clubs who play in top flight English football. One of them is Liverpool, the other one is Everton, and they're rivals. And so the question is, like, would we expect to see a backlash effect among rival fans, Everton being one example of a club that would be a rival club? And actually, I don't think it's in my slides. It's definitely in the paper. We do actually see a small backlash effect among Everton fans. Although when you look at the group of other top flight English clubs more broadly, you don't see so much of a backlash effect relative to the general public, for example. And so we think that this is probably driven by the fact that the exposure that fans of rival clubs are getting with Salah, it's not fulfilling that positivity exposure, right? And it's also undermining one of the key principles of contact theory, which is that the contact is competitive instead of cooperative. So actually, I'll get to that now in the Twitter analysis because we look exactly at the other big clubs.
Just one more thought on that. I wouldn't necessarily expect a backlash in the sense of an increase, but simply an Everton fan couldn't care less about Salah.
So I think what you'd expect to see is you would expect to see this, let's say, divergence where the Liverpool fans are becoming more positive, and then the fans of other clubs are either staying the same, so they have no effect, no change in their view of Muslims, or potentially they could worsen. And so this is something that we look at actually in this upcoming analysis of fans of rival clubs, because you're exactly right. Like we're kind of agnostic about which direction that would go in. We just know that we wouldn't expect it to be as positive as the exposure with Liverpool fans.
Selma, before you move on to the next section, I'm really interested in the matrix completion method. I know that's quite new, and I was curious, like, what brought you to use that method, and any challenges you faced relative to more standard, well-known methods.
So I mean, there's a lot of advantages of this approach. I mean, in a way, it almost feels like cheating because it's great that you can kind of upweight the control units that have a similar pre-treatment pattern, but it's really from a causal inference perspective, that's what you want, right? You want like the closest match between treatment and control pairs in the pre-treatment period. And one other thing that allowed us to do that is that we have several control units. So when you're in a situation where you don't have that, so it doesn't make sense to create this composite synthetic control. So we had like the data structure allowed us to do that. And at the same time, like if you can actually match based on pre-treatment trends, like why not do that, right? Like that's what you most care about in terms of predicting the future imputed trajectory. So that's my 2 cents on it. But my co-authors also go into this a bit more in the paper if you wanted a love letter to the synthetic control with the matrix completion method.
Cool, thanks very much.
Sure. So we apply the same research design to an analysis of Twitter data. So hate crimes in a lot of ways are a very extreme outcome, and they are relatively rare. And so we wanted to get a sense of, from a more everyday perspective, how our fans and everyday people who maybe wouldn't engage in hate crimes, are we lowering prejudice toward among those people? So what we did here, so just so you know the analogy, so in the previous analysis, I showed you Merseyside County versus non-Merseyside counties. And what we're doing here is we're looking at fans of Liverpool compared to fans of the other big 5 clubs plus Everton. So these are very similar fans, like they're kind of drawn from a similar pool of people. And then we want to see if we see this divergence after Salah joined in the rate of their, let me think about how to phrase this, in the sentiment of their tweets, conditional on a tweet being about Islam. So what we did was we ensured that these are all really old followers of the clubs, so that there's no like selection into the sample based on Salah himself. Like if you love Liverpool because of Salah and you then started following Liverpool on Twitter, you're not in this sample. So we scraped really kind of sorting from the oldest users. And this method allowed us to collect about 15 million tweets from 10,000 followers of all these clubs that I just mentioned. So how do we classify if something is anti-Muslim or not? So we identified tweets about Muslims. There was about 44,000. And by the way, we scraped all of these people's tweets. And then we coded them into whether they were anti-Muslim or not. And we did that using Crowdflower, which is a service that uses actual humans to look at a sample of these tweets, and then they code them as being positive or negative, these tweets about Muslims. And then we use that information to train a classifier, basically, and then applied that to the larger sample of the 15 million tweets. and we use the exact same matrix completion method to impute what we would have expected to see in the post-treatment period had Salah not joined among, in this case, looking at fans of other clubs. And jumping into the main results, so it's a very similar graph. So we see here this divergence around the time that Salah joins of what we would have expected Liverpool fans' Islamophobic tweet rates to look like relative to what we actually saw. And we actually see about a halving of the proportion of anti-Muslim tweets relative to what we would have expected. To put that in absolute terms, about 7% of tweets were anti-Muslim, and then it dropped to about 3%. So it's about halving, but in absolute terms, it's still relatively small, but in relative terms, it's still a pretty big drop. So it seems like there might be something going on here. Yes.
Just a small question on the Twitter results. Is there a way, so could it be that the effect from the drop in anti-Muslim tweets is that, you know, the people who were prior to Salah joining and being successful became less racist, or they realized that on Twitter, within my fan pool, it became less quote unquote socially acceptable to release that stuff? So personally, I'm still, you know, anti-Muslim, but I'm less likely to tweet it because I now have the feeling that among the pool of fans, it became less acceptable. At the end, I mean, you know, it's probably difficult to disentangle these two things, but maybe you could look at whether there's more counter-reaction to anti-Muslim tweets on Twitter after that, after Salah.
Yeah, that's actually a good suggestion. We've been wrestling with this ourselves. You're totally right that we're not able to determine whether these effects are driven by the personal prejudice of these people tweeting, or for that matter, in terms of hate crimes, is it really that the bigots are themselves becoming less prejudiced, or have we changed a social norm that it's now become more stigmatized to openly express your prejudice, whether it be in the form of a tweet or whether it be in the form of a hate crime? And these are fundamentally very social phenomena, right? Like, so it's really hard to know if you're changing people's personal, you know, inwardly held attitudes or not. But this is actually a nice idea to see whether there's more like social punishment for tweeting those things, for example. That might be actually get us a little bit closer at the social mechanism. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask another one?
Yeah.
You have these tweets at daily frequency, I would guess, right?
Yes.
Because you show us monthly graphs. How much is the effect dependent on success? So, okay, Salah scores pretty much every match, but still there are games where he isn't performing as well. And are people then less enthusiastic about him?
So we actually, in the survey experiment, which I'm about to show you, we do actually disaggregate the results based on whether people answered the survey on a day that he scored and also on a day that Liverpool wins. And we don't see a big difference, but that's actually fundamentally a little bit different of a research design, because that's only among Liverpool fans who are already exposed. I actually can't remember off the top of my head if we did the same exercise for these two analyses. I'm going to have to dig into the appendix, and if not, we should definitely do that because we do it for the third analysis.
Yeah. And on Paul's point, I was thinking one way to do that, and probably that's what he had in mind, is to look at the followers of followers. So if you look at a person who isn't following Liverpool, but follows a Liverpool follower, how these ideas spread or not.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. I'm just writing that down. Followers of followers. Yeah, I mean, if this is like a social thing, then that's exactly what you'd expect to see. Maybe some spillover in a way.
If I can ask one more, very general one. It seems to me that in all kinds of leagues, there are also players that constantly are confronted with hate in the stadium, like Balotelli in Italy. There would be chants wherever he goes. The opposing
like any
side
black player in Italy, really.
Yeah, exactly. So in what sense is your result externally valid. So there is this one nice chap that everyone likes, and we see some positive effects, but you could probably pick 50 other players where whatever they do on Twitter, people go bonkers.
I'm gonna save this for our generalizability discussion, because it's actually something we've thought about, and what I'd actually like to open this question up to others, because I'm sure we all have our like favorite examples of this working or not working, and I think that that discussion would actually really help us get toward the generalizability. So yeah. I have some ideas, but I'm gonna save it because I think it's an important discussion. Yeah. Okay, so jumping into the survey experiment. So it seems like we have some evidence here that there is this effect of Salah joining on some behaviors capturing prejudice toward Muslims. And so we wanted to explore the mechanism. So if this is really happening, so what is it about Salah in particular that is driving this behavior in fans? So we ran some Facebook ads, and we targeted people who have liked the Liverpool page and who live in the UK. By the way, this is actually a great way to field surveys. I just want to do my plug for this because it was really cheap and we got so many clicks. And that's especially the case if you can use this targeting in the Facebook ads manager based on like location and interests. And you can actually, if you have a very niche sample, it can be useful. So we ended up with over 8,000 respondents. The median respondent is 54 white, high school educated. And so going back to those conditions I initially outlined, so we think that the positivity of the exposure matters. We think it also matters that he's very visibly Muslim. So people were then randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions. So either the pure control or rather 5 with the pure control. So the pure control sees nothing. They just see like a picture of Salah and some very basic information about him. The second group sees a prime that talks about how Salah is successful and also that he is a religious Muslim. The third condition looks at this success. It primes the success condition, and also that he has a very nice character. He's a really nice guy. He donates to charity. He's always laughing and joking on the sidelines, and he's and really talking about the charismatic aspects of his personality. So here we're looking at success as part of positivity, and then we're looking, and the character is also part of positivity. And then we have on the other side this religiosity prime. So how important is it that he's very explicitly Muslim? Then we look at kind of the flip side of this. So half of the respondents see a prime that he is not successful. So this was actually at the beginning of last season where he was off to kind of a slow start to tease out the importance of success. And then they also then get assigned to either the religiosity prime or the charismatic nice guy prime. So here's what the religiosity prime looks like. So we have a picture of him prostrating in Muslim prayer after he scores a goal, and we talk about how he's known for being Muslim on and off the pitch. After every goal he scores, he touches his head to the ground. He fasts during Ramadan. He shares well wishes on the Islamic holidays, and his daughter is named Mecca. So we're really, really reinforcing this link between Salah and Muslims and Islam more broadly. So jumping straight to the main results. So we look at 3 different outcomes here. When we look at how much the respondent says they have in common with Muslims, British Muslims. Then we look at how people feel about immigration. Do they think immigration is positive or negative? And then the third and final outcome is about Islam. Do you think Islam is compatible with British values? And so we don't see much movement when we ask about Muslims in the UK, not much movement when we ask about immigrants, but when we ask about Islam in particular, we see that priming people to think about Salah as a religious Muslim shifts this outcome. And you see the same thing on the principal component outcome as well, which is driven by that item. We don't really see an effect of reminding people of his character or about reminding him that he's successful or even that he's a failure. So once you get that religious prime, it doesn't really matter if he's successful or not. In the treatment that you get, you're still likely to report more likely to report that Islam is compatible with British values. And I just want to kind of to step back for a second and say, what does the survey experiment tell us? So it does not tell us the effect of contact on prejudice, because all of these people have been exposed. They've all had contact with Salah. The question is really conditional on having that exposure. What seems to be driving the positive attitudes or rather behavior? And it seems that making this explicit link between Salah and Islam is driving those effects. And that might be because, he's not necessarily a typical British Muslim. He's actually not in that sense a British Muslim. So the vast majority of Muslims in the UK are South Asian. I think just around 5% are Arab. So that salience might not be there. And then looking at the impact of immigration on the UK, he may not also be perceived as a typical immigrant. That link might not be very clear, whereas the link is probably the clearest between Salah and Islam, especially after that prime that really talked about his religious practice. So pooling these different treatment arms together to look at the average marginal component effect. So just to make that clear, we see that religion seems to be pushing the belief that Islam is compatible with British values and the principal component outcome. Some positive effects on feeling something in common with Muslims, but not very precisely measured, and really no effect on reminding people that he's a nice guy, or that he's successful, or that he's failed. So what have I shown you guys today? So we've seen that that exposure to Salah is associated with a 16% reduction in hate crimes, first and foremost. And so why could that be? We've already discussed some possibilities. It could be that the fan base is happier. So is it just that people are happier because their team is winning? It's something about Muslims or hate crimes in particular. But when we look at the other types of crimes that we have in our data set, we actually don't see this same effect. It's really, hate crimes really stands out relative to the other hate crimes, the other types of crime. So it's not just this mechanism of people are happier, so they're committing less crime in general. That's not the case. So it really seems like there's something specific to prejudice toward Muslims who are the victims of hate crimes disproportionately. And we've touched on this before with some of the great comments we've had. So hate crimes are social acts. It could be that he's actually made really bigoted people less prejudiced, or it could be that the average people in this area now stigmatize Islamophobia, and so there's more social sanctioning for expressing that Islamophobia. We've also seen that anti-Muslim tweets halved after Salah joined Liverpool relative to fans of other clubs. Could this be driven by a backlash among other teams? We don't see any detectable difference when we look at Everton, and also compared to when we look at the effect on other top flight clubs relative to the general public. So the trends among the other top 5 clubs and the general public are actually pretty similar. And we do this using a random sample of tweets from the general public. So it's not just something about these clubs having some kind of backlash effect. They seem to be following what everyone else in the country is doing in terms of a trend line. So we wanted to explore why we might have seen this drop in prejudice, and our results are exploratory, but they seem to reaffirm the importance of having the salient link between Salah and Islam, which helps us think about generalizability as well. So when would we expect this effect to generalize? So we point to 2 conditions in particular, which are known among contact scholars. So we're not being totally original here, but these really stood out to us as fitting into our case study. So first, we think exposure might reduce prejudice when it's positive. So we've seen from other work that negative contact disproportionately shapes intergroup attitudes relative to positive contact, and it seems to be the case here. So against the backdrop of all of this, so the entire study period basically, contact with Salah was positive. So we're not really able to speak too much to what the counterfactual looks like if Liverpool really starts bombing. I guess we're gonna have to start scraping more tweets, and inevitably when things don't go as stellar as they have been going. But we can't necessarily speak to that, but we think there's something about this positivity. And second, it seems important, again, that the identity of the outgroup member is salient. And this speaks to other work by contact scholars that shows that if you are a prejudiced person, like your instinct is to build a little mental fence around someone when you meet them from the outgroup if they don't seem to be typical. So it's easy to then make excuses and say, oh, but he's not like all the other Chinese people, or he's not like all the other Muslims, like, oh, he's special. So then I don't have to update on how I feel about the group more generally. But when that person is really seen as typical, it's harder to make that argument to yourself. And so it's easier to generalize those positive effects outside of the contact partner and toward the entire group. Of course, more research on this is needed. I'm sure we all have our favorite examples of celebrities from stigmatized groups who have risen to a position of prominence. And this can go really well or not so well in terms of broader attitudes toward their group. Some people here might watch the Great British Bake Off. I don't know if there's a lot of overlap between this this particular seminar series and that show. But one of the winners of that show, which is one of the most watched in the UK, is originally from Bangladesh, and she wears a headscarf, and she won this, very classically British TV show. And we saw a lot of the same talk in the media, like, is she reducing Islamophobia? The first Black captain of the South African rugby team, this could be another example to look at. Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and the reboot of that show on Netflix has also led to similar speculation. Like, is this exposure, this mediated exposure to these real life celebrities, is that somehow changing people's attitudes and teaching them to unlearn? Yeah, teaching them to unlearn their prejudice. And so we touched on this earlier, but it's really hard to study this because we think positivity matters, and it's really hard to predict when someone is going to get positive media coverage, regardless of what they do. And a perfect example of this, which we discuss in the paper, Manchester City has, so another top flight English team, has two young, incredibly talented players. One is Phil Foden and another is Raheem Sterling. And they're about the same age. They joined the club about the same time. And within a span of a couple of months, both of them bought their respective mothers a house. And if you just look at the headlines in the Sun and the Daily Mail, it's very obvious that the media treats these two guys very differently when there's no obvious reason to do so. So one of them, talking about Phil Foden, who's white, says, promising starlet, Phil Foden buys his mom a holiday home, like, how sweet. And the other one is like, Sterling, who has been benched and yet to score Premier League goals, splashes all his cash on 25 million. So you can just see that in the valence of these headlines, there's a big difference between how the media treats Black and white players. And it's really hard to predict that. We speculate a little bit what we think drives positive versus negative media coverage. And one thing that has come to light in this discussion is the importance of potentially not taking on politicized political stances. So for example, Colin Kaepernick, like, a lot of us are familiar with this NFL player who really popularized the idea of taking a knee to protest the police brutality against Black people in the US, which has now gone global, this sign. And he has not signed to, his career has been completely frozen. He's been let go. He hasn't been playing American football in years because of this, because it was just seen as too polarizing of a position to take. And so is there some effect of celebrities taking on polarized political stances? By definition, the fact that it's a polarized stance or it's controversial might divide up the audience in a way that makes it less likely for these positive effects to generalize and update on the entire group. It might be that if you pick up a political cause and that cause is related to your group identity, so like Colin Kaepernick taking on the cause of social justice for Black people in the US, it might be that that's not necessarily countering any stereotypes. And that's one mechanism that we think might potentially be important if celebrities are acting in a counter stereotypical way. So this is all to say that we need a lot more studies to try to figure out when this effect generalizes. A comment we had earlier was, there are some celebrities where no matter what they do, it seems like the media will just not give them a break. And I think Raheem Sterling is one of those examples. Colin Kaepernick is another one of those examples. And it might have something to do with the politicized stances. We're not sure. Salah does not take on any political stances. So he quite famously does not talk about Islamophobia, doesn't talk about Muslims, he has not picked any political issue, really. The one time that he did, he actually refused to shake the hand of an Israeli football player when he was playing back in Switzerland. This was early on in his career, and he really divided Israeli fans, for example. And actually, in response to this paper, we had a lot of backlash from Israeli fans on Twitter as well. And so it more affirms to us that taking on these stances could potentially be detrimental. So that's what I have, and I'm gonna leave the slide up for us to digest, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Salma. We have a few questions in the chat. The first one is by Sasha.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear.
No, that's,
okay.
Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, I can't hear for some reason.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I think it's back.
Yet? No. Does it work now?
Yes.
Okay. Sasha, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering what share of Twitter followers and people in your Facebook experiment are themselves Muslims?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. So we don't ask about religion in the survey. We ask about ethnicity, where people are overwhelmingly white. I think it was maybe around 90%, but obviously you can be white and Muslim. So I don't have a good answer to that. There could be some creative ways to try to figure out who's Muslim on Twitter based on like what's in their bio or who they follow, which actually might be worth exploring.
Okay. Klaus? Klaus? And then
I see his question here though in the
yeah.
With the survey on Facebook, you were hiding this as an ad. In the ads, was it possible to run a poll? I think it is possible to do a Facebook poll, but I think it has to be within the context of a group. So I don't think random people would see it. This was back when we were running this like more than a year ago now, so that might have changed. The way that we did it was that people who follow Liverpool and who live in the UK saw this ad that just said, would you like to help researchers better understand LFC fans? And so they then clicked that ad, and then it took them to a Qualtrics link, and then we gave them the full survey. And we actually, of these 8,000 responses that we got, those were completed surveys. So most people who clicked went on and finished the survey. So we didn't use a poll. How many survey questions were there that you needed to use PCA? There were only 3. We just kind of did the PCA just to, get a little bit more precision and have it makes sense also theoretically that these things might be very closely related and have a decent like Cronbach's alpha, and why not put them into one index that captures prejudice overall. But we break apart the results. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
How much variance then did the first PCA component explain?
I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's in the appendix.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't remember that. But we also split them apart by the individual items because I think that is also, there is some meaningful differences between them in terms of who the outgroup is specifically that we're asking about. So closely related, but not enough that we would like only go with the PCA.
Okay, thank you.
And then I also see a question, is Liverpool distinct from the other cities in the sample in terms of voting / Brexit patterns? Yeah, that's we really tried to think about how to situate Liverpool as a city in what was going on in England more broadly. So if you speak to people from Liverpool, a lot of them will tell you it's a very tolerant city, and it's a port city, and it has this history of multiculturalism. There's also a fantastic study that looks at the causal effects of Liverpool fans boycotting the Sun. So they don't, for many for one idiosyncratic reason, they boycotted this newspaper, which kind of peddles like right-wing conspiracies. And that has actually been found to increase the pro-EU attitudes among people who live in Liverpool. On the other hand, when it comes to specific intergroup attitudes, it's really hard for us to know. Like Merseyside is still in the top 5 counties in the UK in terms of hate crime prevalence per capita. So we have a lot of kind of competing pieces of information, and it's also, we couldn't get a decent data source to try to figure out how often intergroup interactions happen in Liverpool. So I'm sorry if that's unsatisfying, but it was actually very hard for us to situate whether Liverpool was an easy or hard case for this study. Like there seems to be a lot of different trends happening there. And I have another question. Do you worry about the good participant role in the religious priming treatment wing? Is Palash, maybe Palash can explain it to me.
Yeah, so what I'm wondering is that when you actually prime them towards the religious identity of Salah, do individuals think about the fact that you're trying to discern whether the impact of this priming is going to lead them towards specific outputs? Or like
right, so like demand effects or something, or Hawthorne effects. Yeah. Yeah. So this is like a very this is a classic concern really with any survey-based outcome. I would point to two things I'd say in response to that. The first is that that's kind of why we wanted these different data sources. I think that really strengthens the inference, especially when we look at behaviors, where behaviors are, you have a little bit less of this. For these real world behaviors, it's less of a concern, like what are researchers looking for, what's okay to say and not to say. Those naturalistic behaviors kind of get around this problem of demand effects. And then the second thing I was going to say is, like, we have a great experimental study from Mamolo and Peterson, or my colleagues at Stanford, which just experimentally tests for demand effects among researchers on MTurk, I believe, and they don't find anything. So I'd say, you know, it's possible. I think it could also go the other way. Like, people might be like, oh, who are these weird people asking me these questions? Clearly they want me to like out myself as a bigot or something, and they just, you know, just burn the whole study down and just answer randomly. So I think it could also go the other way. Like, people might get offended by this, if anything. So I think it's definitely possible. But I think you would get this with the other primes potentially as well. Just this, they know that they're being studied. There's like the IRB information. So I think it's not super discreet in a way. Yeah. So I'd agree with you. It might have been a little on the nose. What are your standard errors in the analysis of hate crimes and tweets? I don't keep track of standard errors in my head, but I think the confidence, the same graphs I just showed you with all the confidence intervals, I think you'll find in the appendix as well.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Can I ask you another thing about the tweets?
Sure.
The followers could be anywhere in the world, right?
Actually, they were based in the UK. We filtered just to those in the UK.
But they can be anywhere in the UK.
Yes.
And so the question is, okay, on one hand, you have the hate crime that is really local to Liverpool, Merseyside. But the other things, there could be someone in Cornwall, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, anywhere, right? And I'm wondering whether somehow there is an interaction with the local context, if you can measure that in any way, if you can localize the tweets. So if in an area with lots of Muslims, people react to Salah differently than if you go to one of the home counties where there is only white British people above age 70.
Yeah, that's actually a good suggestion. I wonder if I'm not sure actually if my colleagues have looked into this and what level of specificity you can go into on Twitter for pinpointing geographic location. But that's a great idea. Yeah, I think there is probably something about, especially if we're thinking about a norms-based explanation or social norms, something about living in, you know, the red side of Liverpool where this is really all around you. It increases both your dosage and it might potentially increase the like social repercussions for expressing Islamophobia. So I think there's lots of ways that the context can interact. And we do ask our survey respondents as well, like what city they live in. So I think if we can do this on Twitter and also do it on the survey to like subset down to those people. In fact, we have done this on the survey. I'm remembering now. I think we did some subgroup analyses for the survey, and we looked at whether people live in Liverpool. And if I remember correctly, I think that interaction was of getting the religious prime and living in Liverpool. I don't think it was significant, but I think it was consistently positive, so kind of went in the right direction. But this is a good suggestion with regards to the Twitter analysis.
Also got a couple of questions. First question, do you see heterogeneous effects by age at all? Like, you can imagine that younger supporters are more malleable, for example.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a great suggestion. We can easily do that. I mean, we control for age, but we haven't looked at that as a subgroup. Yeah, I think there's probably I think our sample size is even big enough that we might even be able to have that be like somewhat continuous or binned, rather than just young versus old. But yeah, that's a great suggestion. We can do that.
Awesome. And then the second question is, with the Twitter data, you could perhaps look at intergroup interaction. So if you've got whole people's timelines, then you could see like if you identify the followers as Muslim or not, you could maybe see what kind of conversations people were applying, that kind of thing, and it might give you a measure of that. Sorry, that's more a suggestion than a question.
Yeah. No, that's a great suggestion. I think if we can have some approximation of who is a Muslim in the Twitter data, this would also speak to how much of what piece of the results are driven by Muslim supporters themselves tweeting specifically about this issue, like rather than more like everyday comments about Muslims in a political sense. So is it more like, Muslim followers are tweeting more about Islam because they're proud of him, and like that's driving some of this? So I think that would be really good to know from our perspective, like who is tweeting what, and in which direction is it going. I think that's a great idea.
Thanks.
Can I invite you to speculate a bit? Assume he leaves the club next week. What do you expect?
If I were going to speculate, I would say that things would get worse. That's what I think. I think people do love him, and I think this squad has now cemented its place in the history of the club. Like, this is a golden squad, clearly. But I say this based on my reading of what's happened with players, other similar players, you can say, from stigmatized groups. So we have some great quotes in the paper from Eric Cantona, Mesut Ozil, Lukaku. So these players have all come out like very publicly and said, okay, yeah, I'm Belgian when I score. When I lose, I'm from the Congo. Or like, oh yeah, as long as when we win the World Cup, I'm German. Like, as soon as I mess up, now I'm a Turkish immigrant. Or like, yeah, like, Cantona said something like, oh, it's all like, red, white, and blue when we're winning the World Cup. And then after that, it's like black, Arab, white. So I think there's something to this if you take a historical perspective. I do think Salah is exceptional in a lot of ways. So I don't think that the exposure to those other celebrities is as positive. So Ozil, for example, like, he's had kind of a bad attitude for a long time. At the same time, there seems to be I do take seriously his allegations that he's experienced a lot of racism in the German Football Association. But he's seen as, not really making an effort, and he's been kind of declining for a few years. So you could make that case, like, okay, he's maybe seen as like not working hard enough, whereas like Salah really works hard. But again, this all fits into this very problematic narrative of this, model minorities. Like, you have to perform, you can't have a bad day to earn your place here, and so that we can like you. And it's a very conditional kind of respect. And as much as I think that Salah is unique in both in how visible he is in his Islam and also how positive he is as a person, he's always seen as like a hard worker. At the same time, I don't know how immune he would be from, just as his career continues. The real question is how much stamina is he going to have in his career? Like, how many seasons can he keep this up? And, eventually it's going to dip. And, unfortunately, my reading from all these other players suggests that I would expect at least a small dip if and when that happens. But I want to hear what you guys think. Are there Australian equivalents?
Hi, Salma. I had a question touching up on this point. You raised the case of Raheem Sterling, who originally was at Liverpool, and he was really loved by the fans, and they had high hopes for him. And then he left for, in their opinion, plastic club to Manchester City. So I was wondering, since I think it was also in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So basically when Salah arrived at Liverpool, if I'm not, or the year before.
He arrived a little, yeah, just before he arrived, yeah.
So I was wondering if you could, it's probably, I'm not sure, maybe the data already has enough information. So it kind of seems like the other side of the coin, right? Like, you have this player who's loved and is also from a minority, and then he falls out of grace after his transfer. So I was wondering, like, maybe the data is already there, because otherwise it would probably be a lot of work to like look at this. But I was just wondering if you could also see if prejudice becomes worse after he leaves, or like the circumstances he leaves as compared to before. So it's kind of like the opposite, or is it only this effect that if you have this kind of icon that it kind of that it has a positive effect? I would hope that there is no negative effect for minorities after he left, but knowing soccer fans, I have a feeling that might not be the case.
Yeah, this is actually a great idea. I'm not sure if our pre-treatment data would go back long enough to do like a good analysis, but actually me and my co-authors on this are actually working on a book project just looking at this topic. And I think Raheem Sterling is an excellent case. And especially when you leave to a rival club, that's a really special form of animosity that happens. So it's one thing if Salah starts doing badly and Liverpool does badly, but he's still with the team, versus if he actually goes to a rival club. I think that would definitely make things worse. And then Sterling also came out and said a lot of really not nice things about Liverpool after he moved. And so that, I think, made it even worse. But thank you for the suggestion. I think that's a great player to look at. I think Pogba's another one to look at.
Salma, on also on Sasha's point. Oh, sorry, Sasha, I jumped the queue. I just see her hand raised.
No, go ahead.
So to test, the effect, what happens if, Salah leaves. So the first thing is your data. Does it go over multiple seasons, or can you at least look what happens? I mean, you could do it potentially with the Twitter data. What happens in the breaks, like the winter break, I guess. Not sure if that's long enough. So that's the first thing. The other thing would, again, require collecting more data. But at least in Europe, you have this idea that, you have kind of partner clubs where, I don't know, I only know it from Austria, that Rapid Vienna and I think it's Glasgow or Celtic, I don't know, are like the fans are really close. I think just because they have the same color, that's often sufficient. But probably you have that with Liverpool as well. So maybe within Europe you have partner clubs. And I mean, the community is pretty strong. They would cheer for each other. They would watch the matches. And then you could maybe, if you see an effect of a positive effect that you find with the Liverpool fans, if you find that with, I don't know, partner clubs in France, Italy, and Germany as well, you could then maybe take that as some, let's say, auxiliary evidence that, the effect is really about the player and his success rather than the social environment, because it's less likely that, if you are a partner club in Italy, that Salah's performance changed the social environment. So it's more than your change in attitude was really driven by the player's performance, because it's such a, specific knowledge that, has this effect.
That's very cool. I hadn't thought about this partner club thing. Yeah, I think that could be a great thing to look at. Yeah, that's great. And especially if it's by colors, like that's kind of a cool, exogenous thing to look at. Yeah, I don't know thought of that.
With Liverpool and yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
I mean, a more general theme about other players is ultimately also an econometric one about the placebo checks, right? If you just picked 100 other players, the top 100 players, and I'm saying just in quotation marks, I know it's a shitload of work, but you would do the same synthetic control stuff and then show these, I call them spaghetti graphs, and you want to see whether the Salah effect stands out from the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, this is the idea for the book. I think that if once we get to a place where we can actually start comparing across trends for celebrities, that would be amazing. I mean, I think something that I find very powerful about the hate crime analysis is that you have at least the data on all the other types of crime. And so it's getting at this, like it's basically a placebo check, like things that you wouldn't expect other types of crime, like, car break-ins or something. You wouldn't expect that to change. And so that just, I think, adds a lot more credibility to the findings once you start getting at this wider comparison of placebos. I totally agree.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I think the time is up. Well, let me thank you, Salma, for the very interesting, great talk. And the only thing I can say, maybe, you know, in the near future, if you ever happen to be in the region, I mean, conditional that we can travel again, please let us know and we can invite you for a proper seminar. And, you know, yeah, it was great to have you.
And please email me if you have any other thoughts. And if there's any Australian equivalents of this, I know there's a lot of like Aboriginal sports stars in particular. I'd be very interested if you think there's someone that we should be looking at in particular.
Mm-hmm.